Hello, friends. We often think of the Victorian era as a time of rigid logic, industrial smoke, and stiff upper lips. But beneath the top hats and corsets lay a world paralyzed by fear of the unseen.
It was a period of staggering duality, an age of roaring steam engines and cold scientific breakthroughs that was simultaneously obsessed with spirits, dark omens, and the heavy mysteries of the afterlife. Imagine a society that could map the stars, yet trembled at the thought of a fallen mirror. Consider the humble beekeeper who felt a grim necessity to whisper his master's passing to the hive so the insects wouldn't fly away or perish in grief.
Picture the mourning parlor, where every glass surface was carefully draped in black cloth to prevent a departing soul from being snared in its own reflection. Even the grave offered no certain peace. The terror of being buried alive led to the creation of safety coffins, fitted with delicate copper bells, meant to ring out from beneath the damp soil if the occupant should suddenly wake. I'm just a narrator, guiding you through these archives of the strange. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, please consider subscribing to stay a while. Before we light the gas lamps, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, get comfortable. Take a deep breath and let us walk together into the fog of 1880s London.
The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with more than just rain. There is a residue of coal smoke and frantic progress. You are standing in the heart of the most advanced civilization the world has ever seen. To your left, the pulsing rhythm of a massive steam engine drives a factory that produces goods for every corner of the globe. Above you, telegraph wires hum with messages traveling at the speed of thought, bridging oceans in seconds. Science is the new religion, and the British Empire is its cathedral. Yet, if you look closely at the door frames you pass in these narrow streets, you might see a horseshoe nailed upside down to catch the luck, or a smear of salt on a cold stone windowsill to ward off something unseen. This is the great Victorian contradiction. It was an age of relentless reason that remained desperately, almost feverishly afraid of the dark. We often think of progress as a light that chases away shadows, but in the 19th century, progress only seemed to make the shadows longer and more defined. As millions of people abandoned the rolling green hills of the countryside for the soot-stained brick of the city, they did not leave their ghosts behind in the fields. They packed them into their suitcases and carried them into the slums. The ancient folklore of the hearth, stories of changelings, omens, and woodland spirits, was suddenly squeezed into overcrowded tenements and winding alleys. In a rural village, a strange noise at midnight might be a fox in the brush. In a London tenement, that same sound, echoing off damp shared walls, became the herald of a lingering curse. This massive displacement of an entire population meant that the superstitions of the past were forced to adapt to a world of iron and gaslight, creating a hybrid form of urban myth that was far more claustrophobic than anything found in the open woods. But there was a deeper, more tragic reason for this obsession with the supernatural. In the 1880s, life was incredibly fragile, a thin thread stretched over a sharp edge. Despite the marvels of modern medicine and the rise of a comfortable middle class, death was not a distant event, it was a constant roommate. 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday, and half of all children born in the city did not survive to see their 5th. Cholera, typhus, and consumption haunted these streets, striking without rhyme or reason. When science failed to explain why a healthy child withered in a single week, people turned to the irrational for comfort and a sense of agency. If you could predict a tragedy through a bird flying into a room or a clock stopping at the exact moment of a pulse fading, then perhaps you could exert some small measure of control over the chaos. Superstition was not just a collection of silly habits, it was a survival strategy for the human soul in an era where the reaper was always standing just an inch behind your elbow. The tone for this national fixation was set at the very top of the social ladder. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe and the figurehead of global industry, lived in a state of perpetual frozen grief. After the death of Prince Albert, she turned mourning into an art form and a heavy civic duty. For 40 years, she dressed in the deepest black, surrounding herself with mementos of the departed. She popularized the practice of wearing mourning jewelry made from the actual hair of the deceased, and insisted that Albert's shaving water be brought to his empty room every morning, as if he might step out of the ether at any moment. This royal endorsement of ghostliness trickled down through every layer of society. If the Queen herself was communicating with the beyond and honoring the spirits, who were the common people to ignore the whispers they heard in their own attics? Death became a spectacle, a fashion, and a national hobby. The Victorians did not just fear the end, they invited it into their parlors for tea and biscuits. As the fog thickens around us, we begin to realize that the gas lamps were not just lit to see the road ahead. They were lit to keep the nightmares of a grieving empire at bay. The heavy oak door swings shut, cutting through the swirling yellow haze with a definitive hollow thud. Inside, the air is different. It is thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, floor wax, and the metallic tang of the coal fire. For the Victorian family, this was not just a shelter from the rain, it was a sanctuary against an invisible world that was constantly trying to find a way in. We often think of the Victorian home as a place of rigid manners and stiff collars, but beneath that polished surface, every room was a fortification. This was the domestic sphere, a private battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of the family. At the center of this defense stood a figure of quiet, unyielding power, the woman of the house. History remembers her through the sentimental poetry of the age as the angel in the house, a creature of gentleness and domestic grace. But in the context of the supernatural, she was something much more formidable. She was the family's primary spiritual sentry. Her job was far more complex than simply managing servants or balancing the household accounts. She was the minister of spiritual hygiene, responsible for a constant cycle of rituals designed to purge the home of the shadows we left behind on the street. To a Victorian woman, a dirty doorstep was not just a sign of laziness, it was an invitation to misfortune. The act of scrubbing the front steps with white hearthstone every morning was as much an exorcism as it was a cleaning chore. By marking the boundaries of the home in bright, clean lines, she was drawing a protective circle, a barrier that the filth and the ill omens of the city could not cross. This was a world where a spilled salt cellar was not an accident, but a breach in the defenses. It required an immediate counter-ritual, the pinch of salt thrown over the left shoulder, straight into the eye of the devil who was always lurking just behind the chair. Every corner of the home had its own set of rules. Mirrors were not just for checking one's reflection, they were windows that could trap the spirits of the living or provide a doorway for the dead. If someone fell ill, the mirrors were covered in black crepe, not out of vanity, but to ensure the soul of the sick person did not wander off into the glass and get lost. This was the burden the Victorian woman carried. If the bread failed to rise, it might mean an ill-wisher had looked through the window. If the fire sputtered in a certain way, a stranger was coming, or worse, a coffin was about to leap from the grate. The home was a living, breathing entity that needed constant placating. We see this obsession with spiritual hygiene reflected in the manic cleanliness of the era. The Victorians were beginning to understand the threat of germs, but before the germ theory of disease was fully embraced, those invisible killers were often indistinguishable from malevolent spirits. Sickness was a shadow that entered through a crack in the moral or ritual armor of the household. Therefore, the dusting, the polishing, and the constant sweeping were acts of holy war. A speck of dust was a foothold for decay, and decay was the precursor to death. The angel in the house spent her days in a state of high alert, interpreting the language of the inanimate objects around her.
She watched the way the tea leaves settled in the cup, and the way the birds flew past the nursery window. Her world was a dense thicket of signs and wonders, and her vigilance was the only thing keeping the fog from seeping through the floorboards. As we move deeper into the Victorian parlor, we see that the clutter was not just a fashion choice. Every trinket, every heavy velvet curtain, and every framed lock of hair served a purpose in this grand defensive strategy. The domestic sphere was a closed loop, a carefully maintained ecosystem of superstition, where every gesture mattered, and every ritual served to keep the nightmares of the empire exactly where they belonged, on the other side of the locked door.
Yet, even with the deadbolts thrown and the heavy curtains drawn, there was one threshold that no key could secure, the threshold of the womb. In the Victorian mind, the period of gestation was not merely a biological process, but a 9-month-long vigil, a psychological tightrope walk, where the mother's every thought, sight, and fright were etched into the developing clay of her child. While the Victorian era is often remembered for its advancement in surgical techniques and the birth of modern nursing, the nursery remained a place where science took a back seat to the ancient, whispering fears of the hearth. Medical men of the era, despite their encroaching scientific rigor, often remained captive to the theory of maternal impression. They believed the expectant mother's imagination acted as a literal stencil, transferring external stimuli directly onto the fetus. This belief was so entrenched that it dictated the very architecture of a pregnant woman's life. If she startled at a scampering hare, she risked her infant being born with a cleft lip, a hare lip as it was cruelly known. If she looked too long at a fire, a red strawberry mark might bloom across the child's cheek. The world was a gallery of potential deformities, and the mother's eyes were the shutters of a camera she couldn't always control. There are accounts of women avoiding public hangings or even zoos, fearing that the sight of a caged animal or a mangled limb would irrevocably twist the limbs of their unborn. This placed a crushing burden of responsibility upon the woman. Any physical imperfection in her child was not seen as a quirk of nature, but as a failure of her own self-restraint or a lapse in her visual hygiene. This superstition extended even to the woman's appetite. If she developed a sudden, unyielding craving for a particular fruit, say a raspberry or a plum, she was urged to satisfy it immediately. If she failed to do so and happened to touch her own body while thinking of the food, it was believed the child would bear a longing mark in that exact spot, shaped and colored like the forbidden fruit. This created a strange social grace where a pregnant woman's whims were treated with a frantic, superstitious urgency. To deny her was to risk scarring the next generation. When the moment of birth finally arrived, the drama shifted from the mother's mind to the physical remnants of the delivery. Most revered was the caul, a rare piece of the amniotic membrane that sometimes clung to a newborn's head like a translucent veil. To modernize, it is a biological curiosity, but to the Victorians, it was a biological winning lottery ticket. A child born with a sillyhood was destined for greatness, or at the very least, protected from a watery grave. These dried membranes were frequently advertised in the classified sections of London newspapers, commanding prices that could equate to months of a laborer's wages. The market for cauls was surprisingly robust. In the mid-1800s, a genuine caul could fetch 30 guineas, a staggering sum. Sailors were the primary buyers. They believed that as long as they carried a piece of a stranger's birth caul in a pouch around their neck, the sea could never claim them. It was a bizarre economy of hope, where a scrap of shriveled skin served as the ultimate life jacket in an era of frequent shipwrecks. These were often sold with legal affidavits from midwives to prove their authenticity, revealing a fascinating intersection of the commercial and the mystical.
But even with a healthy child in the cradle, the danger had only just begun. The nursery was a front line in a war against the invisible. The folk traditions of the British Isles, still pulsating beneath the surface of Victorian gentility, warned of the good folk, the fae who envied human vitality. There was a pervasive dread that a healthy, rosy-cheeked infant might be whisked away in the dead of night and replaced with a changeling, a withered, sickly, and demanding fairy creature that would never thrive. To prevent this supernatural kidnapping, the Victorian nursery became an arsenal of cold metal. Iron was the great repellent of the spirit world. Parents would hide a pair of open scissors or a sharp kitchen knife beneath the mattress of the crib, believing the raw edge of the blade would sever any magical tether. A fire poker left across the cradle was a barrier no shadow could cross. It was a stark, cold contrast to the soft linens of the nursery, the sharp, unyielding steel of the industrial age used to fight the ancient terrors of the dark. Often, a father's coat would be draped over the cradle to claim the child for the world of men. These rituals provided a supernatural explanation for the heartbreak of failure to thrive or the onset of childhood illness, giving grieving parents a monster to blame rather than a god who had simply looked away. Every knife under a pillow and every scrap of dried membrane was a defiant shout into the fog, a way to tell the darkness that this new life was guarded, protected, and spoken for.
But the protection of the cradle was merely the first movement in a lifelong symphony of caution. As the child matured and the specter of the nursery faded, the focus of these rituals shifted from the preservation of life to the pursuit of love. For the Victorian youth, the most profound mysteries were not hidden in the dark corners of a cathedral, but in the reflection of a silver bowl. We have come to view the final night of October as a season of ghouls and macabre theatrics, a time to flirt with the imagery of death behind the safety of a mask. Yet, for a young woman in the 19th century, Halloween was the most romantic night of the calendar. It was a sacred window, a moment when the veil between the present and the potential grew thin enough to offer a whispered hint of a husband.
Picture a candlelit parlor, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted nuts, and the sharp tang of autumn air. There were no monsters here, only the quiet, humming anxiety of those wanting to know whose name they would eventually carry. They called it Nutcrack Night, a time for divining the heart's direction. A group of friends might place pairs of hazelnuts on the grate of a fireplace, naming them for potential suitors. If a nut burned quietly alongside its partner, it signaled a peaceful union. If it hissed or popped away in a burst of sparks, the match was doomed to a volatile end. The rituals grew even more intimate as the clock ticked toward midnight. A young woman might take an apple, peeling it in one continuous spiraling strip, being careful not to break the ribbon of fruit. She would then toss the skin over her right shoulder and wait with bated breath. The shape it took upon the floor was no mere accident of physics. It was a character, an initial, a signature written by the hand of fate itself. Or, in a more chilling display of devotion, she might stand alone in a darkened room, clutching a hand mirror while eating an apple and combing her hair. If the stars aligned and the spirits were moved, the reflection of her future groom would appear over her shoulder. If she saw a skull, it was a message that she would never reach the altar, but the grave instead. It was a game, certainly, but it was played with a trembling hand. In a society where a woman's entire social standing, economic security, and personal safety rested upon the man she married, these omens were far more than parlor tricks. They were the only maps available for a journey through a wilderness of uncertainty. When that destiny finally manifested in a formal engagement, the superstition did not retreat. It intensified, becoming a rigid framework for the wedding day itself. A Victorian wedding was not just a celebration of a contract, it was a gauntlet of metaphysical hazards. Every choice, from the day of the week to the specific shade of a ribbon, carried the weight of a lifelong blessing or a lingering curse. The famous rhyme we still recite today, "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," was a literal recipe for protection. The borrowed item had to come from a happily married woman, a way of physically transferring her luck to the new bride.
The blue ribbon was more than a splash of color. It was a ward against the evil eye, a gaze that was believed to be particularly drawn to the radiant happiness of a woman on her wedding day. The color of the dress was a minefield of folklore. While the influence of the monarchy eventually made white the standard, many rural families clung to the old warnings. To marry in blue was to ensure a love that was true. To marry in yellow was to invite a life of jealousy and bitterness. To wear green was to flirt with disaster, as it was the color of the fairies, and to wear it was to invite the jealous folk to spirit the bride away or to brand her a woman of loose morals. Even the fabric was scrutinized. Satin was often shunned as bad luck, a slippery omen for a marriage that wouldn't hold its grip. As the ceremony concluded and the couple prepared to leave, the final act of the day involved the shoes. Today, we might tie tin cans to a bumper, but the Victorian tradition was far more visceral. As the bride left her childhood home, her father might hand one of her old worn shoes to the groom, a symbolic transfer of authority and the heavy responsibility of her care. More commonly, the guests would hurl their own old shoes at the departing carriage. This wasn't an act of aggression, but a frantic attempt to strike the couple with good fortune. A shoe hitting the roof or landing inside the carriage was a sign of a fruitful and prosperous union. It seems chaotic to us now, this flurry of flying leather and whispered rhymes about the moon and the stars.
but look closer at the world they inhabited. This was an era of radical change and sudden, inexplicable loss. These rituals were the tools of a people trying to build a fortress out of tradition. They were attempting to manufacture certainty in a landscape where the ground was always shifting. By following the rules of the ancestors, they hoped to bribe the universe into giving them a little bit of peace, a little bit of love, and a future that would not vanish like the breath of a ghost in the London night.
This spectral uncertainty didn't just linger in the air like coal smoke. It dictated the very layout of the home and the choreography of the public streets. This was an architecture of luck, a hidden blueprint that governed everything from the placement of a silver fork to the direction of a child's slumber. To the Victorian mind, the physical world was a minefield of invisible tripwires, and survival required a constant, meticulous navigation of ritual. They lived in a landscape where a misplaced object or an incorrect gesture could collapse the fragile ceiling of their security. Consider the Victorian dining room, a place of heavy mahogany, flickering candlelight, and rigid social hierarchy. Beneath the veneer of polite conversation and silk waistcoats lay a cold, calculated terror of the number 13. If a dinner party host realized 13 souls were gathered around the table, the evening ceased to be a social triumph and became a potential death sentence. The belief held that the first person to rise from such a table would be the first to die within the year. This wasn't merely a quaint worry for the uneducated. It was a concern that reached the highest echelons of the aristocracy. Some hosts went so far as to keep a 14th man on call, a professional guest, often a younger family member or a trusted clerk who could be summoned at a moment's notice to balance the cosmic scales and ensure that no one at the table was marked for an early grave. Society even saw the rise of 13 clubs, groups of defiant skeptics who met to mock these fears. But for the average Londoner, the empty chair at a table of 13 was a gateway for the reaper. Even the simplest act of seasoning a meal carried the weight of spiritual warfare. Spilling salt was never seen as a mere accident of gravity. It was an invitation to disaster. In an era where salt was a vital preservative and a symbol of purity, to waste it was to let corruption into the house. The instant the white crystals hit the table, it was believed the devil was crouching directly behind the left shoulder, waiting for a crack in the individual's spiritual armor. The remedy was immediate and reflexive. A pinch of the spilled salt had to be flung directly into the face of the unseen tempter, blinding the evil that sought to capitalize on a clumsy hand. This was not a suggestion. It was a domestic reflex as common as breathing. When the heavy velvet curtains were drawn and the candles snuffed out, the geography of the home took over the safety of the soul. The Victorian bed was more than a place of rest. It was a vessel for health and a shield against the void. Many believed that the head of the bed must always face north, aligning the sleeper with the mysterious magnetic currents of the earth. They feared that sleeping across these invisible lines would lead to madness, exhaustion, or a slow wasting of the spirit. To sleep with your feet facing the bedroom door was perhaps the greatest taboo of the Victorian house, for that was the position in which a corpse was carried out. By arranging their heavy furniture with such obsessive precision, they were trying to ensure that when they closed their eyes in the dark, they would wake up in this world rather than the next.
This obsession with order followed them out the front door and on to the rain-slicked cobblestones.
The street was a public theater of omen, where every encounter was weighed for its spiritual significance. Meeting a funeral procession was a moment of profound spiritual danger. A man would never dream of overtaking a hearse or passing it with a casual stride. To do so was to attempt to outpace death itself, a feat of arrogance that the universe would surely punish. One had to stop, remove their hat, and wait in absolute silence until the mourning carriages had passed completely out of sight. There was a specific icy dread associated with an empty hearse returning from a burial. If you looked directly into its dark, hollow interior, you were essentially inviting your own reflection to fill the void. People would avert their eyes or make signs of protection, terrified that the carriage was still hungry for its next occupant. These behaviors were the essential maintenance of a life lived in a world where the thin veil between the living and the dead was constantly tearing. From the way they seasoned their food to the way they positioned their bodies in the dark, the Victorians were master builders of a spiritual fortress, trying desperately to keep the shadows of the fog from creeping across their doorsteps. But when that spiritual fortress finally failed, when the inevitable rattle sounded in a loved one's throat and the light left their eyes, the focus of the Victorian household shifted instantly. It was no longer about keeping death out. It was about managing its heavy, terrifying presence within the walls. This was the commencement of the good death, a concept that turned a moment of profound grief into a frantic, choreographed sequence of survival. For a Victorian, a sudden death was a tragedy, but a death without these specific, urgent rituals was a spiritual catastrophe that could haunt a family for generations. The transition from life to the afterlife was viewed as a literal journey, and the living had a terrifying responsibility to ensure the traveler didn't get lost, or worse, decide to take someone back with them. The second the final breath escaped, the domestic world had to be fundamentally altered. The first movement was almost always toward the clocks. In the hallway, the heavy pendulum of the grandfather clock would be seized and held still by a trembling hand. In the parlor, the ornate mantel clocks were silenced. This was never a symbolic gesture of mourning or a simple way to mark the time of passing for the parish records. It was a calculated act of metaphysical defense. To the Victorian mind, death was a force that operated on its own schedule, a scavenger that followed the ticking of the seconds. By stopping the clocks, the family was attempting to break the cycle of time within the home, effectively blinding the reaper. They believed that if the clocks were allowed to keep ticking, death would remain in the house, counting down the minutes until it could claim the next occupant. They were freezing the household in a state of stasis, creating a pocket of temporal silence where the shadow could find no further purchase. While one set of hands stilled the time, another was already moving toward the windows. Regardless of the season, whether a sweltering July afternoon or midnight in the depths of a London winter, the glass had to be raised. The soul was not seen as a metaphorical concept, but as a literal physical entity that needed a clear path of egress. If the windows remained bolted and the heavy velvet curtains remained drawn, the spirit might become snagged on the architecture of the living, trapped in the corners of the ceiling or the rafters like a panicked bird. A trapped soul was a dangerous soul. It was a spirit that would grow restless, then bitter, eventually becoming a malevolent presence that refused to depart. The sudden rush of cold, soot-laden air into the room was the physical manifestation of the boundary between the material and the eternal being torn open. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. As the soul went out, the elements came in, and for a few minutes the home was no longer a sanctuary, but a thoroughfare for the dead. But it was the treatment of the mirrors that truly revealed the depth of their terror. This is the exact point where folklore moved beyond simple tradition and curdled into a state of absolute, shivering dread. Every reflective surface in the house, from the grand gilded mirrors of the dining room to the small hand glasses on a dressing table, and even the polished silver tea service, had to be covered immediately in heavy black crepe or white linen. The reasoning was twofold and equally chilling. First, there was the fear of the soul being captured.
It was believed that a soul leaving the body was uniquely susceptible to being ensnared by its own image. If the spirit caught a glimpse of itself in a mirror, it could be pulled into the glass, trapped in a silvered purgatory between worlds, unable to reach the light. The second fear was for those still breathing. To look into a mirror in a house of death was to invite a curse. If a mourner caught their own reflection in the same room as the deceased, it was a certain omen that their own soul would be the next to be snatched away. The mirror was no longer a tool for vanity. It had become a portal, a predatory eye that could swallow the life force of anyone who dared to glance its way. Even the glass covering family portraits was often turned to face the wall or shrouded in cloth. The house was essentially blinded, stripped of its ability to reflect, forced into a dull, matte existence that offered no place for the spirit to linger or for the reaper to hide. This frantic activity created an atmosphere that was less like a wake and more like a battlefield. There was no time for quiet weeping until the clocks were stopped, the windows were open, and the mirrors were dark. These actions were the desperate measures of a society that felt the thinness of the veil every single day. They were trying to guide a ghost while simultaneously hiding from it. They lived in a world where the furniture itself could become a weapon of the supernatural if not handled with the proper care. The good death was not about peace, it was about control. It was the belief that if you followed the rules, if you moved quickly enough and respected the ancient logic of the shadows, you might just keep the rest of your family safe from the cold touch that had just claimed your beloved. This was the moment where the domestic became the Gothic, where the familiar layout of a home was transformed into a landscape of traps and exits, all governed by the terrifying necessity of superstition. Through these rituals, the Victorians sought to master the transition, turning the chaotic horror of death into a strictly regulated performance. The performance did not end at the bedside, nor was it a private matter of the heart. To the Victorian mind, grief was a public obligation, and where there is obligation, there is inevitably a market. This was the birth of the great industry of mourning, a massive commercial engine that turned the sorrow of the bereaved into a meticulously tiered system of consumption. If the ritual was the script, then the local mourning warehouse was the costume department, and the local undertaker was the director of a grand, somber theater. The chaotic horror of death was not merely mastered through prayer, but through the ledger and the shop floor. At the center of this costume was crepe. Not just any black fabric would suffice. It had to be this specific crimped silk, treated with heat and chemicals to ensure it possessed a dull, non-reflective surface. In a society that prized the luster of satin and the shimmer of polished brass, the total absence of light on a garment was the ultimate symbol of loss. But crepe was a cruel master. It was stiff,
scratchy, and often dyed with harsh chemicals, including arsenic and logwood, which could irritate the skin or even cause respiratory issues when worn as a heavy veil close to the face. Yet, for a widow, there was no choice. To wear a reflective fabric during the first year of what was known as deep mourning was to suggest a heart that was not sufficiently darkened by loss. It was a visual erasure of the self, a black shroud that signaled to the world that the woman beneath it was socially dead alongside her husband. The rules of this dress code were so complex that they required a literal manual to navigate. Periodicals of the day dictated exactly how many months one must wear black for a first cousin versus a distant uncle, and exactly when it was permissible to introduce the half-mourning shades of lavender, mauve, or gray. To fail at this arithmetic was to invite more than just gossip. It was to face social excommunication. A family that did not spend enough on their mourning attire was judged to be either destitute or heartless, and in the rigid class structures of the 19th century, both were equally damning. This was superstition evolved into social law, the belief that the spirit of the deceased, or perhaps the judgment of the neighbors, could only be appeased through the correct yardage of silk. This theatricality extended beyond the family to the very doorstep of the home. Before the body had even cooled, the undertaker would supply the mutes. These were professional mourners, men hired specifically for their ability to look somber and remain perfectly still. Dressed in oversized black frock coats and tall hats draped in long fabric bands known as weepers, they stood like twin pillars of gloom on either side of the front door. They spoke to no one. They were living statues of grief, standing guard over the house of mourning to ensure that the sanctity of the death was recognized by every passerby. It was a bizarre, paid silence, a commercialization of the very air around the bereaved. They were part of a logistical machine that included black-plumed horses, velvet-lined carriages, and specialized mourning coaches that transformed a simple burial into a royal procession. Inside the mourning warehouses, such as the famous J's of Regent Street, the grieving were ushered into rooms specifically designed for those in the depths of sorrow.
Here, the carpets were thick to muffle footsteps, and the assistants spoke in hushed, reverent tones. It was a shopping experience designed to feel like a religious rite, but at its core, it was a ruthless business. Families would often go into significant debt to afford the proper funeral. The cost of the ostrich plumes for the horses, the velvet palls for the coffin, and the black-edged stationery for the announcements could equal a year's wages for a middle-class household. The pressure to conform was immense, because the funeral was the final statement of a family's standing. A shabby funeral was a stain that could last for generations. It wasn't just about honoring the dead, it was about the survival of the living. To skimp on the crepe or to forego the hired mutes was to signal a decline in status, a crack in the veneer of respectability that no Victorian family could afford. The industry thrived on this fear. They sold the idea that love could be measured in the weight of a veil and the number of black-plumed horses in a procession. If the transition of the soul was to be successful, the wallet had to be emptied. As the era progressed, this commercialization reached a fever pitch, absorbing every object associated with the deceased. There were black-edged handkerchiefs for wiping tears, jet jewelry carved from fossilized coal to adorn the neck, and even specialized mourning fans to provide a breeze that wouldn't appear too spirited.
The superstition that had once lived in the whispers of old wives had been codified, packaged, and sold back to the public as a social necessity. The Victorian world became a place where the soot of the industrial streets met the dark, heavy fabrics of the parlor, creating a landscape where the living were almost as ghostly as the dead they mourned. By the time the funeral procession finally set out for the cemetery, it was less a personal farewell and more a massive, expensive parade of woe, choreographed to satisfy the demands of a society that feared a poorly handled death more than death itself. Every yard of crepe, every silent mute, and every shilling spent was a brick in a wall built to keep the chaos of mortality at bay, replacing the raw, unpredictable agony of loss with the cold, predictable comfort of a commercial transaction. Through the industry of mourning, the Victorians had found a way to put a price on the infinite, ensuring that even in the face of the great unknown, the rules of the marketplace still held sway. While the ledger books of the undertaker recorded the costs of mahogany and crepe, no amount of currency could settle the accounts of the imagination. The Victorian mind, for all its obsession with rigid order and industrial progress, remained haunted by a singular, suffocating possibility that the exit from this life was not always as final as the physician claimed. This was the era of the great medical gray zone. Without the benefit of modern electrocardiograms or neurological monitoring, the determination of death often relied on the fallible observations of the human eye and the warmth of the skin. Taphophobia, the irrational fear of being buried alive, gripped the public consciousness with the force of a fever. It was a terror fueled by the sensationalist literature of the day and by whispers of coffins being opened decades later to reveal claw marks on the underside of the lid. To the Victorian, the nightmare of waking in total darkness 6 feet beneath the damp earth was a fate far worse than the cessation of breath. This collective anxiety birthed a niche industry of safety coffins, ingenious and often absurd contraptions designed to offer the nearly dead a lifeline to the surface. Some models featured complex systems of pulleys and wires attached to the hands of the deceased, leading up through a breathing tube to a silver bell mounted on the headstone. If the occupant were to stir, the slightest twitch would alert a cemetery watchman. Other designs included spring-loaded hatches or air vents, turning the grave into a makeshift survival bunker. While there is little historical evidence to suggest these bells ever saved a soul from a premature end, their existence speaks volumes about a society that trusted mechanical engineering more than they trusted the finality of nature. This preoccupation with the porous border between life and death extended beyond the fear of one's own burial and into the darker folklore of the undead. In the rural corners of the British Isles and the deep forests of the continent, the ancient fear of the vampire began to take on a uniquely Victorian character. This wasn't the sparkling aristocrat of later fiction, but a visceral, parasitic threat that mirrored the era's anxieties about disease and blood purity. The Victorian graveyard, with its overcrowded plots and shifting soil, became the epicenter of these supernatural panics. Even into the modern era, the legacy of these superstitions would find a strange, distorted echo in events like the Highgate vampire panic. Though that specific frenzy occurred a century after the Victorian peak, it drew its power from the crumbling, ivy-choked ruins of Highgate's 19th-century tombs. The public's willingness to believe that a malevolent entity could haunt those Gothic corridors was a direct inheritance from their ancestors, who viewed the cemetery not as a place of rest, but as a gateway that might swing both ways. In the Victorian view, the dead did not always stay put, and if they were to return, it was often through the medium of the shadow and the lens. This brings us to the most intimate and perhaps the most unsettling of all Victorian mourning customs, the memento mori photograph. In an age where childhood mortality was high and life expectancy was often short, the camera offered a miracle that religion and medicine could not. It offered a way to halt the process of decay. Post-mortem photography became a common practice, a final opportunity to capture the likeness of a loved one before they were surrendered to the earth.
These images were not intended to be macabre. They were acts of desperate, tactile love. The deceased were often posed in ways that mimicked the vitality of life. Children were draped across sofas, as if in the middle of a midday map, their favorite dolls tucked under their arms. Adults were propped up in chairs, their hands folded neatly, sometimes with their eyes painted onto their closed lids by a photographer's brush to give the illusion of a lingering, watchful presence. By freezing the dead in a permanent state of lifelikeness, the Victorians attempted to deny the very finality they so deeply feared. They created a world of ghosts captured in silver nitrate, a gallery of the departed who remained forever on the mantelpiece, watching the living with a fixed, unblinking stare. This visual obsession was a way of negotiating with the void. If a person could be seen, they were not truly gone. If their image remained clear and sharp, the darkness of the grave had not yet claimed them. Yet there is a profound irony in these photographs. The very technology meant to provide comfort often produced images that were more haunting than the absence they were meant to fill. The stiffness of the limbs and the waxy sheen of the skin served as a constant reminder of the boundary that had been crossed. The Victorians were surrounded by these echoes, the bell in the cemetery, the folklore of the revenant, and the photograph of the dead child. They lived in a world where the fog was never just weather, but a veil that might at any moment reveal a face that should have been long forgotten. Through these safety coffins and silvered glass memories, the Victorian era remains the most haunted chapter in human history, a time when the world of the living and the world of the dead were separated by nothing more than a thin, ringing wire and a shutter's click. That thin, ringing wire of the telegraph didn't just carry the voices of the living across vast, lonely distances. It suggested a brand new vocabulary for the impossible. If a pulse of electricity could carry a human thought through a copper cable buried under the Atlantic, why couldn't a pulse of spiritual energy carry a message from the great beyond? This was the era where the laboratory met the drawing room, and the result was a fever that gripped the British Empire, from the highest palaces to the dampest Victorian slums. It began with a rhythmic knocking, a code that seemed to mirror the Morse code currently revolutionizing global commerce. But these signals didn't originate from a telegraph station in London or New York. They seemed to rise from the floorboards, or tap, tap, tap against the underside of a heavy mahogany tea table. Imagine a typical Tuesday evening in a wealthy London household. The servants have cleared the dinner service, the heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the yellow, sulphurous smog of the Thames, and the gas lights are turned low until they are nothing but blue, flickering ghosts themselves.
a group of men in stiff collars and women in rustling, restrictive silk sit in a circle, their pinkies touching, forming what they called a psychic chain. This wasn't a dark, occult ritual hidden in a damp cave. It was a social grace. Table turning became the Victorian equivalent of a parlor game, as common as charades or needlepoint, but with an edge of existential dread. They sat in the expectant silence, waiting for the wood to groan, for the legs of the table to tilt and dance, believing that the energy of the departed was physically manifesting in their furniture. To them, the table was a primitive telephone, and they were all waiting for the operator to connect the call. As the movement grew, these manifestations became more daring and more visceral. We enter the age of the professional medium, the charismatic bridge between two worlds. These individuals, often young women who seemed delicate and unassuming, claimed to produce ectoplasm, a strange viscous substance that supposedly seeped from their mouths, nostrils, or ears, acting as a physical conduit for spirits to take shape in our atmosphere. To modernize, the surviving photographs of these sessions look like a clumsy arrangement of cheesecloth, cotton wool, and magazine cutouts, but to a mourning mother or a curious professor in 1870, this was the ultimate evidence. It was the physical proof of an invisible truth. They saw the substance not as a trick of the light or a hidden prop, but as the raw material of the soul, a biological bridge between the seen and the unseen. The most fascinating aspect of this obsession wasn't the supposed gullibility of the masses, but the intense interest of the intellectual elite. This wasn't a rejection of science, it was a desperate attempt to expand it. We see the rise of the Society for Psychical Research, an organization that counted among its members some of the most brilliant minds of the age, including Nobel Prize winners and renowned physicists. They approached the seance room with the same meticulous rigor they used in the chemistry lab with the observatory. They brought weighing scales to measure the medium before and after a session, believing the loss of spirit energy might register in ounces. They brought cameras with magnesium flashes to capture the fleeting apparitions, and they placed bells inside vacuum-sealed glass jars to see if a ghost could ring them without disturbing the air.
They were trying to catch a ghost in a butterfly net made of logic and mathematics. Perhaps no figure embodies this strange paradox more than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who gave the world Sherlock Holmes, the literal embodiment of cold, hard logic and deductive reasoning, became the most vocal and tireless champion of spiritualism. It seems like a contradiction that shouldn't exist. How could the man who insisted that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, believe so fervently in spirit writing and fairy photographs? To Doyle, the afterlife wasn't a matter of blind faith or religious dogma. It was a matter of observable evidence. He believed he was simply following the clues to their natural conclusion. He saw the medium's cabinet not as a magician's prop, but as a scientific apparatus, a sort of spiritual test tube. He and his contemporaries were trying to map the geography of the soul using the tools of the Industrial Revolution. They were men of the Enlightenment caught in a storm of grief and rapid technological change. The Victorian world was disappearing under a layer of soot and steel, and as the old religious certainties began to crumble under the weight of Darwinism and geology, people looked for a new kind of certainty, one that could be measured, photographed, and recorded. They wanted a heaven that could be reached by a wire. In those quiet, darkened rooms, as the table began to shake and the medium's voice dropped an octave into the rasp of a long-dead ancestor, the line between the physical and the metaphysical didn't just blur, it vanished. They weren't just looking for ghosts, they were looking for a law of spiritual thermodynamics that promised nothing was ever truly lost. They believed that if you could just find the right frequency, if you could just tune the instrument of the human mind correctly, the fog would lift and the dead would be revealed as neighbors just on the other side of a very thin wall. This wasn't a retreat into the Dark Ages. It was a bold, if misguided, march toward a future where the laboratory and the cathedral were one and the same. And while the skeptics cried fraud, pointing to hidden pulleys and pockets full of lace, the believers held their psychic chain tight, listening to the rhythmic thumping in the floorboards as if it were the very heartbeat of the universe.
That heartbeat of the universe, so carefully curated in candlelit parlors and resonant through the wooden floorboards of a London townhouse, was about to be drowned out by a rhythm of a far more violent nature. The lace, the pulleys, the hidden pockets, and the rhythmic thumping belonged to a world that believed death could be managed, choreographed, and even invited for tea. To the Victorian mind, the transition from this world to the next was a scripted event, a grand domestic theater governed by a complex etiquette of black silk and weeping willow motifs. They believed they could hold the hands of the departed, keeping the door to the afterlife slightly ajar through sheer force of will and a few clever parlor tricks. But this intimate domestic relationship with the end of life could not survive the sudden, cold industrialization of the grave. As the calendar turned and the 19th century's long shadows stretched into the dawn of a new, more jagged age, the world found itself standing on the precipice of a catastrophe that would make the Victorian séance look like a childhood game. The Great War arrived not as a guest at the table, but as a gale that blew the candles out and scattered the spiritualists' cards to the wind. Between 1914 and 1918, the scale of human loss underwent a terrifying, incomprehensible transformation. It was no longer a matter of a single patriarch passing away in a four-poster bed, surrounded by grieving kin who had months to prepare their veils and stationery. Instead, death arrived in the form of thin, yellow telegrams delivered by the thousands to neighborhoods that had already been emptied of their young men. The sheer, staggering volume of the dead broke the machinery of Victorian mourning. The rituals that had sustained the generation, the 2 years of deep black crepe for a widow, the strict stages of half-mourning, the intricate jewelry woven from the hair of the deceased, were designed for a world where death was an occasional visitor. When death became a permanent resident of every street and every village, the old etiquette became a physical and emotional impossibility. You cannot wear full mourning black for years on end when every house on your street is a house of sorrow. To do so would be to plunge the entire nation into a permanent, suffocating darkness that the economy and the collective psyche could no longer support. Furthermore, the Victorian obsession with the body, the need to wash it, watch over it, and dress it for a final viewing, was thwarted by the reality of the Western Front. Millions of young men vanished into the missing lists. There were no bodies to bring home, no coffins to drape in lace, and no graves for mothers to visit with fresh flowers. The physical absence of the dead created a void that the old superstitions couldn't fill. When a loved one is vaporized by an artillery shell or swallowed by the sucking mud of the Somme, the idea of a medium tapping on a table to summon their spirit begins to feel not like a comfort, but like an insult to the gravity of the loss. The heavy, suffocating layers of Victorian grief required a certain stability that the 20th century utterly rejected. These were rituals of the home, but the Great War took death out of the parlor and into an industrial wasteland. The funeral industry, once a thriving trade of plumed horses and elaborate monument carving, found itself overwhelmed and eventually streamlined. The surviving world was too exhausted and too traumatized to sustain the performative sorrow of the previous century. People began to realize that the elaborate veils and the mourning rings weren't bringing the dead back. They were merely anchoring the living to a past that had led them into a slaughterhouse. As the guns fell silent in 1918, a new, colder wind began to blow through the ruins of the old superstitions. This shift was accelerated by the 1918 influenza pandemic, which brought the horror of the trenches back to the domestic doorstep. Death was no longer a mysterious Gothic visitor to be bargained with through a medium or romanticized in a poem. It was a biological reality, a clinical failure to be managed by doctors, nurses, and bureaucrats. The rise of the modern hospital and the professionalization of the mortuary meant that the dead were whisked away from the family home almost instantly. The intimate, hands-on care of the corpse, once a vital part of the mourning process, was outsourced to professionals behind closed doors. This was the birth of the modern clinical view of mortality. The parlor, once the center of the Victorian wake and the site of many a frantic séance, was consciously renamed the living room in the years following the war. It was a linguistic attempt to scrub the house of its ghostly associations and to focus the family's energy on the present rather than the afterlife. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back to let in the light of a new era, one that valued efficiency, hygiene, and a forward-looking stoicism. Society shifted its gaze toward the neon lights and the frantic, desperate energy of the 1920s, leaving the hidden pulleys, the mourning fans, and the rhythmic thumping of the floorboards to gather dust in the attics of a forgotten age. The Victorian era had tried to bridge the gap between the living and the dead with silver bells and silk ribbons, but the Great War had widened that gap into an abyss. In the end, the world didn't stop believing in ghosts because it found answers. It stopped believing because it simply couldn't afford to look back anymore. The heartbeat of the universe had been replaced by the ticking of a medical clock, and the shadows in the fog were finally chased away by the cold, sterile glare of the modern world. Yet, even as the gas lights flickered out and the electric bulb hummed into existence, the ghosts of the Victorian mind didn't simply vanish. They retreated into the quiet corners of our subconscious, finding new ways to linger in the rituals we perform without a second thought. We like to imagine ourselves as children of reason, governed by data, medicine, and the hard edges of physical laws. But look closer at our modern lives, and you will see the Victorian fog still drifting through our hallways. We are more like our ancestors than we care to admit, clinging to the same small anchors in an ocean of uncertainty. Consider the way we mourn. When we attend a funeral dressed in somber black, we are not merely following a dress code, we are participating in a visual language perfected by a grieving queen in the 1850s. To the Victorians, these dark garments were a protective barrier, a way to signal to the world, and perhaps to the spirits themselves, that the wearer was in a state of transition. Today we call it respect, but the weight of the fabric carries the same ancient gravity.
We still cover the faces of the dead. We still speak in hushed tones. And many of us still feel a primal, wordless urge to stop the clocks in a house of passing, as if time itself should stand still out of courtesy for a soul on its way out. Our celebrations are equally haunted. A modern bride often frets over a checklist of items, something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. We treat it as a charming bit of folklore, a photo opportunity for a wedding album. But for a Victorian woman, these were essential defenses against the evil eye and the perceived fragility of a new beginning. We still throw rice or flower petals, a sanitized version of ensuring fertility and warding off the lean years of hunger. Even the simple act of clinking glasses for a toast traces back to the hope that the sound would scare away male malevolence. We have kept the choreography of the superstition, even as we have forgotten the lyrics to the song. The mirrors in our homes still hold a strange power over us. When a glass shatters, a brief, irrational flicker of anxiety usually follows, a ghost of the Victorian belief that a mirror held a piece of the observer's soul. To break the glass was to fracture the self, inviting 7 years of misfortune as the soul struggled to repair itself. We laugh it off, but we rarely leave the shards on the floor for long. We still avoid walking under ladders, a habit born from a medieval fear of breaking the holy triangle formed by the ladder against the wall, but reinforced by Victorian sensibilities about order and the precariousness of the industrial world. We knock on wood to prevent jinxing a stroke of good luck, an echo of the ancient belief that spirits lived within the timber and could be summoned for protection or silenced so they wouldn't steal our joy. Why do these habits persist in an age of satellites and genomic sequencing? The answer lies in the nature of the human condition, which has remained remarkably unchanged since the first fog rolled over a cobblestone street. The world is a place of immense, terrifying beauty and staggering randomness. We live in a universe that does not always provide explanations for why a fever takes a child, why a storm ruins a harvest, or why a sudden accident changes the course of a life forever. The Victorians understood, perhaps more than we do, that life is a fragile thing held together by very thin threads. Superstition is not a sign of ignorance. It is a profound human coping mechanism. It is the brain's attempt to find patterns in the static, to create a sense of agency where none exists. By avoiding a certain number, or carrying a specific charm, or performing a small ritual before a big event, we are whispering to the universe that we would like a say in our own destiny. We are trying to negotiate with the chaos. These small acts provide a psychological bridge over the abyss of the unknown. They give us a handle to grasp when the world feels too slick and fast to hold on to. We have traded the seance table for the algorithm and the omen in the tea leaves for the forecast on a screen, but the underlying hunger for certainty remains. We still look for signs. We still want to believe that if we follow the right rules and respect the old boundaries, we can keep the shadows at bay. The sterile glare of the modern world has illuminated the physical room, but it has not silenced the whispers in the attic of the mind. As the sun sets on our own century, we carry the Victorians with us. We carry their fears, their hopes, and their desperate need to find meaning in the fog. We are still those same figures standing on the shoreline, watching the mist roll in, reaching out with small ritualistic gestures to make peace with the vast and silent dark. The heartbeat of the universe still ticks away, indifferent and immense, and we continue to count the beats, hoping that if we just keep the right rhythm, we might never have to step into the cold alone. The shadows are never truly gone, they have simply become a part of who we are. In every nervous glance at a broken mirror, in every black tie at a graveside, the Victorian world lives on, reminding us that the fog is not something to be feared, but the very atmosphere in which the human spirit learns how to survive.